Happy Friday. It is Friday the 13th, and we are back for another Pay Practitioners panel. And today we're going to talk about something spicy. We're going to talk about cost of living. Does it matter to compensation professionals? And one of the things that really kind of got me interested in this particular topic for this week was I was reading an article, and we published a little bit about it, but I thought this was fascinating. The city of Santa Fe this year has coupled their minimum wage to CPI and rental housing prices in the city of Santa Fe. I've never heard of such a thing. I thought it was really unique. As a comp person, I go, ew, I don't know if I like that or not. But I don't know if I'm the only person that shares that opinion. So I wanted to hash that out and then other things along those lines around cost of living. Does it really matter for comp? Should we care about it? Because I think it is what a lot of our employees think about. It's what they hear about. It's something that's very easily accessible online, whereas cost of labor, it's a little more ambiguous. There's a lot more paywalls behind finding actual cost of labor. And there's not a lot of great sources out there for employees to learn about. Really, they can only learn about cost of living. So let's kick this off. And I mean, just show of hands. Who thinks that the city of Santa Fe who thinks that's a great idea with no potential for unexpected consequences down the road from now, 5 years from now? Okay. Maybe.
I'm doing it like a half. I like the first part of that, and then you were like, without any potential consequences. So I don't know.
So Nancy, so you're kind of the maybe I like it, maybe I don't like it. What do you like about this idea? What do you like about the approach?
I like that it's not tone deaf. I like that it's thinking about employees. I like that, so I mean, I know what we've all been taught, the compensation scripture that has been handed down over the years is we're supposed to focus only on cost of labor. And there's a lot of really good reasons why we do that. And I think then when you're an employee and you're like, okay, except my groceries just went up like easily $100. And that's like significant to me. And it is like, it's painful. Like now I'm at a point where I have to make choices about the things that I'm buying in a way that I haven't been before. And so I feel like, an employer just being like, but we just care about cost of labor. It just sounds so uncaring. So I'm not saying that, indexing on certain things is necessarily the right approach. I think the devil is in the details. But I do encourage or respond positively to, listening to what's really happening on the ground with your employees, particularly if you have lower income employees.
Yeah.
I don't think you can ignore cost of living. Let's put it that way. I also don't think the explanation, I do feel a little bit like, the Charlie Brown teacher voice when people just start talking, so much about cost of labor. It gets a little wah, wah, wah. I'd like to encourage people to just, again, you can begin with that, but then maybe there are other ways to address the cost of living issue. But I do think it has to be addressed within rewards in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that, cost of living, like setting a minimum wage, like, to comply with locally, all of them are based on cost of living. Right. New York's wages, it's expensive in New York. California, it's expensive in California. They're not setting these minimum wages off of cost of labor because that doesn't matter when you're setting a minimum wage. So to me, I feel like it might be the first county or city or whatever that has said specifically that we're using cost of living to drive our minimum wage requirement in the city. So and people do cost of living adjustments every year, right? I mean, a lot of people that don't do merit just do a straight cost of living adjustment. Social Security does cost of living adjustments. So but I do think it's different when you're setting a standardized minimum wage versus trying to figure out, you know, what your pay structure should look like in San Francisco versus, you know, Columbia, South Carolina. So I don't know if that's, you know, I'm right, wrong, or I'm indifferent about it. I think it's fine that they're doing that, but I think it's kind of already been done. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm off camera for all because I see a super delayed video, but just to touch on that, I'd be interested if they thought or considered actually doing stipends versus using the CPI or the rent within CPI, because the reason why I say that is it's so volatile, right? And I think we were all waiting for the day as far as hybrid jobs, how this was going to change cost of living, cost of labor expectations. And now we're kind of seeing it. Last year, I believe Queens went up about over 10%. And mainly because people are working hybrid and they not necessarily want to live in Manhattan, they want to live in Queens. And so that drove up 10% the cost to live in Queens now. Well, is that to say that we go and increase salaries based on that? I don't know. Maybe we do the stipends and see how that plays out, because another city like Plano, where they had a big surge in 2023 and then it decreased last year and now it went down 2%. So what do you do in those volatile situations? So that's just another area to consider, is looking at utility stipends or rent stipends, and see how that might play out.
That is so smart, Ashley. That's exactly, yeah, that's, I think, where I love those suggestions, and where I think total rewards practitioners can lean into the fact that there are other rewards that they can be looking at. So I think, yes, base salary can be based on certain things, but what are the things that we can do to help ease the pain of maybe what might be a more temporary situation? I know folks always say the danger is it gets folded into base salary or it becomes an expectation. But there again, I think with some education, with, again, the caveats, hey, this may be something that we're going to remove, but we also want to recognize that you're having this issue. Or I liked how you said, Ashley, like whether it's something that you can allocate directly around housing within that context, or, even gift cards at local grocery stores or something like that. Like this idea of using other rewards, right, at your disposal to just help keep people whole, and say that you're continuing to monitor it, knowing that the situation is volatile. I feel like that too just affirms people's, pain, that, all right, at least I know they're looking at it. They're not just giving me the normal cost of labor, song and dance.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of our conversation the last time we got together around sort of decoupling performance from base salary, because from that business perspective, those types of things are volatile, right? We're talking about lots of different things that aren't consistent year over year, where that salary and that wage bill is. And so from a business standpoint, looking at the cost of labor is defensible. It's economically sound, but we are dealing with humans, and what employees feel is the cost of living. So I think it's, to your earlier point, Nancy, it's about sort of thinking about, how can we best utilize our funds to motivate people, but then how do we hear them and understand them and not sound tone deaf when we say, well, it's the cost of labor and here's what goes into that economic driver. At the same time, we're not going to, set skills and wage, labor supply and demand on the cost of eggs, right? That's just not going to be the way that we price these things. I think it becomes kind of back to the trend we're seeing in comp, where, it's a lot more about communication, a lot more about meeting folks where they are and their understanding of what goes into this work, the business acumen side of things too. Yeah. And recognizing that cost could mean less jobs, that, there's levers that, and things that happen. I don't know.
No, and I love one of the things that you said, and I think it's one of kind of the core pillars, or one of the pillars of compensation teams: recruit, retain, and engage through dollars. And I think that that we've always had base pay, we've always had incentives, we've always had long-term incentives. But I think that one of the things we have to look at is what are the other levers that can help to engage and motivate people. And I can tell you that the most meaningful rewards I have ever received in my career were not bonuses, they weren't salaries, but they were things that were meaningful and thoughtful. Like I remember getting, it was a gift card because we had a really one weekend that we worked through the weekend. It was a gift card to a restaurant I liked, and it was a GoPro camera. That was something I really wanted at the time. And while that is not your standard pay, but it was something meaningful. And I think an organization, I think there's a big push for organizations, especially with the millennial generations and Gen Alpha coming into the workforce down the road, where people and organizations are more aligned to, you're more culturally aligned. And I think doing those things can certainly help to engage, retain, and motivate people to do the things that you need to do. So I love that you brought it back to kind of those standard pillars of compensation teams.
Yeah, I mean, when you shared sort of that kind gesture, right? Like that's a manager who knows you and is willing to kind of. I'm just thinking about one experience there. I was given a thoughtful written card, and like I put in 20 extra hours that next week because that mattered so much to me. It felt really good, and it was just one of those things that like that didn't cost a thing, but it was being seen. The recognition side of things is important.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things I want to come into as well is because I hear this a lot when we're talking about cost of living. I am a married man with no children, and I have a modest place that I live. I have a modest car that I drive, but other people have 2, 3, 4, 5 children. They have expensive cars. They have expensive houses. Everyone's cost of living is different. So how does a compensation team or how does an organization balance those challenges? Because I think those are meaningful challenges that employees, to your point, I need a dozen eggs a week, whereas a family may need 2 dozen eggs a week. I'm curious, how have you addressed that with employees or management or leadership when there is a question about how do we address and consider cost of living when it is so different for every person? That's one of the biggest things I hear why we shouldn't address cost of living, because it's based on decisions that we make. I'm curious if anyone has had experiences and been able to really kind of have a good conversation that's moved the needle forward with that.
2 years ago at World at Work, there was a conversation around the Ford Foundation doing a study around their livable wage, their cost of living, and it was diving into like, what is our employee population? So is our employee population single parents, families of 4, and kind of doing a study around what's the livable wage for our people. I thought that was a really interesting study, and you just sort of see that like there's a lot of work that goes into that. And maybe the starting place is you might have some of that data through your benefits enrollments and dependent data.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't dived into that kind of a study before.
I think it goes to, again, expanding sort of the thought around rewards and being really thoughtful about who is our employee population and what are the outcomes we want. So I think about things outside of, say, comp, like social determinants of health and a lot of those studies that around, especially like if we think about, say, so we're all comp folks and we're not wrestling with what our benefits friends are wrestling with, which is that like unbelievable, increases in healthcare right now and health insurance. And so, there's a lot of motivation on the part of companies to make sure that they're investing in the right places and controlling costs. And I think when you come at it from the sort of the cost control standpoint, you tend to kind of treat the population as sort of a monolith, and you're going to be a little more employer centric. But I like the idea of turning it on its head to say, yeah, but let's think about everybody's sort of different situations. And so is there a floor maybe in terms of what we want for employees? How does that marry up to who we are as an organization, what we're trying to cultivate culturally? And then I think it is getting them really nuanced and segmenting maybe those roles that will have a different approach for. So I'm thinking of something I just saw on LinkedIn by the folks at Levels FYI. They were looking at it from the offer and being a candidate and just saying that, hey, if I'm living here, this same offer is really what I'm bringing home, unless, versus if I'm living over here. And I feel like everybody makes different choices depending, right, on that. So I think it's a question of, I think that the nature of that post, or the gist of that post, was like, think about the offers that you're making, which I think is smart, right? And yes, think about the offers that you're making to the talent that you want. I guess my thing is, because like, how much do you want them, right? And like, what are you willing? What are the trade-offs you're willing to make? And I think you're willing to make the trade-offs for certain types of talent, where maybe you'll up that offer depending on where they live, and you will be a little more sensitive to, okay, yep, you're in an expensive area, and yes, we're going to match that, versus other segments of the population that you might be like, no, we're not going to do that. We need to stabilize, and we need to make sure. And usually, to me, it's the more, populated jobs, right? That you're just going to be like, yeah, we need to toe the line here. Like, this is how we're going to manage costs, as well as what we're willing to invest. Here's the floor, but here's the ceiling. And so I think it's just being thoughtful around that philosophy. So, but I think it's going back to things we've talked about. It's not one size fits all, and it's not just sort of one point of view that I'm just going to use one piece of data. It's really being thoughtful about, like you said, Catherine, what are all the different data elements, and how do I really think about the employee experience that we're trying to cultivate that makes sense for our company.
Yeah, and I really like the comment that a LinkedIn user put. I don't see their name in the chat, but they said standard of living is different than cost of living, and choices people make, debt people get into, like that's not the company's responsibility to maintain their standard of living. So. But yeah, I mean, it is the company's responsibility to make sure that none of their employees are on SNAP benefits or, welfare or anything like that. That should be, there should be some kind of a livable wage, even though that's a tough thing to calculate and figure out. I'm helping a credit union right now raise their minimum wage from $15 to $18 and then to $20 in another 6 months. So, there are companies out there that are still, concerned about the employees, and they know that they need to bring that floor up, which is really the most that you can do right now, unless you want to get into all these one-off conversations and decisions about, gift cards or grocery store gift cards or, whatever as stipends to help people with. Those seem like you can't give everybody the same thing. You should, but I don't think you could. It would be very selective in how you would have to figure that out. So yeah, and anything that you start giving someone, it becomes a takeaway if you stop it, right? So that's like Justin, I'm sure you were upset when you didn't get a second GoPro camera, right? Like, where's my other one?
I always find it interesting when companies will sort of start looking at their own minimum wage and sort of what's driving that. Like I worked with a credit union, and what was driving that was they were losing folks to go work at Popeyes, at, a totally different industry where they had spent this time sort of training their folks. And then they looked at, the fact that they weren't competitive just across multiple industries. Mm-hmm. And then, there's, to your earlier point, right? Like there's gives and takes. There's something else that has to give to be able to afford that, whether that's, headcount or benefits, whatever it may be.
Right. And
Yeah.
if you do make the decision to raise that floor, I mean, just because, and you base it off of cost of living, but then cost of living goes down at some point, you're stuck. You can't go back down. Right. So, yeah. You're going to say something.
Yeah, it does. And what we're talking about is, something that even the most mature compensation teams can't keep up with. And so how, thinking, especially as an in-house employee, how do I administrate that? How do I make it sustainable? And it's not, I don't think you can every time, there's a swing in the data, you make reactional changes. But maybe having certain, okay, above 10%, that's where we flag things. That's where we take it to leadership, or we do twice a year reviews, or we do compensation sprints. So, 2 to 3 weeks out of the year, you have your compensation team get in a room and just look at all your locations, whether, globally, whatnot, and solve that together. Because as internally you're thinking about the approval process, the communications, the rollout on all these things. And that's just a whole other ball game that takes a ton of time as well. And by the time you're done, it's already changed. So
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I like the idea of sort of stress testing all of these things against, remote work, transparency, the mobility that happens within your organization, and then sort of sitting down and saying like, okay, I'm going to document this. This is what we intentionally are going to do. And then maintaining that consistency. Because, as soon as you sort of say like, this is how we're doing it and make an exception, the water cooler talk, the trust is broken. So I like the idea of sort of doing those compensation sprints to then sort of check your philosophy, check your practices, and then, educate and communicate around it.
Yeah, that sounds like it's like Ashley, like you're talking about setting up a really great system to
Yeah.
me, which is really what it should be. It shouldn't be this annual exercise. It can be something that you can be monitoring and then setting up sort of a threshold of when does something, to your point, Catherine, like when does it qualify? When does it, if we have a framework of decisions that we're making, when does it pop up as, we better do something? Is there sort of a differential? Is there a trend that's happening? Like, how do we set up that framework so that we know very quickly, okay, we're getting a signal that we need to, and like, I like how you're saying, Ashley, kind of come around, let's discuss it as a team, make some decisions, and then determine, what goes next. I guess my question would be, I know you're saying with the communication and the rollout, but if it's, I guess, if you're doing something like that in the context of this broader framework, and you can, maybe there's an opportunity to kind of communicate that, we monitor things in an ongoing way, and from time to time we will be making adjustments. And then knowing, I mean, I understand that there are compliance rules around how far in advance, and like for instance, there are certain states you need 30 days before you make a compensation change. You have to notify them. But like putting that aside for a minute, making it where it is something that, yeah, we're going to, you may receive an adjustment, or maybe we do it at this. I know some of the customers I worked with, they would have a certain time of year. They have, sort of traditional compensation planning happening at one time, and then maybe mid-year or 6 months later, there's a different type of planning that goes on, and that's where we do different adjustments and things as well. And it's so that way, at least you have like that. It's controlled and it's to be expected, and it's not maybe as heavy a lift because it's more of a system, like you're describing, this sort of ongoing process.
Yeah, I like that. And totally agree. And even, how transparent your company already is. So are you already disclosing pay ranges? Are you not? And to your point, Nancy, a lot of employees probably already do say that they do market reviews each year, and that's part of their comp philosophy and policies, that they are looking at that, and just keeping that kind of open, and equipping managers with the process as well, in case there are questions. But I totally agree. It doesn't have to be a very specific raw communication, but it should, I would think, if you are at that level of transparent already, it should be at least addressed.
Yeah, I wonder how you guys talk about what cost of labor is, right? Because I think sometimes employees, like, it's helpful for them to hear, and then other times I wonder if it is, like, or do we just open up a can of worms?
Yeah.
Like when I think about it, I always say, like, where there is education, universities pumping out strong talent, where there's lots of industry hubs and strong companies, like, you're going to have a market where there is higher talent, and then a higher cost to it, which often then correlates to higher cost of living as well.
Sure. Yeah.
But I'd be curious how you guys, like, I mean, that's just kind of like an initial thought on some of the ways that you describe cost of labor, but I'd be curious what you would share with employees to help them understand that as an economic measure. Just like there's cost of goods, just like there's cost of sales, right? There's cost of labor.
Well, I think that's an interesting question. And, we're all about the market. And so when you start getting to a point where your employees won't move to a location because you're not changing the pay because they understand the different fluctuations, then you might want to revisit your strategy. So I think that's a good question. I think companies are switching from like really focusing on their comp philosophy to like more comp reality and what we have to deal with, and what we see within, it changes every year. And I can go back to my CCP books and look at that information, but it's not going to have any of this stuff in there. So I think it's joining together and, really networking with your other colleagues and professionals, staying in the loop with your recruiters, listening to that feedback on a timely manner. I think that's super important right now.
Yeah.
I like the nod to recruiters too, right? With survey data being a lagging indicator, right? They have the understanding of that supply and demand of skills, which, might take some time for us to get a benchmark for AI engineers to know, 1 or 2 years worth of data. So that relationship with TA is an important one, I think, for comp.
Yeah, and I think too, I guess, Catherine, when it comes to explaining cost of labor, I mean, I am going to say, like, we're all kind of nerds, and so we're fascinated with it, but I'm betting a lot of people aren't. So, so I don't know how, I mean, beyond, I think, just like you're saying, I love how you put it, Ashley, like, just how you're saying, like, maybe putting it in the language of, right, a recruiter that's just saying, like, you understand, like, in order for somebody to live here, it costs them so much more. So this offer is just not going to fly, or that kind of a thing, or like, or, something, a more recent development. Like I know Boise, Idaho, right? There was an extreme rise in housing and stuff during the pandemic. And people are just like, how are we going to deal with this? And I don't know. And I always go back to assess what you have, how many people are impacted, and then that's going to help you come up with a plan that's viable, that you can afford, and that maybe you want to invest in, before you, get too crazy about it. But those are the things that I think, just putting it in sort of like that plain language, I'm always a big fan for that. I don't know. Again, that's where I kind of go back to the Charlie Brown teacher voice of, saying the cost of labor, it's wah, 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 wah. Like if you're taking too long to explain this, just, explain.
Yeah.
This is how we pay for most locations. If you live here, though, we recognize that, for instance, it costs a lot to get that apartment or to buy a house here versus if you live here. So that's why, like to me, that's the same with geographic differentials, like explaining them. It's a similar kind of conversation. Yes, we pay higher. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much you all experienced it. I know we did, where there were folks that were freaking out about having to post, the thought of having to post a range different for one location versus another was freaking some folks out. And I guess for my part, I was kind of like, I was a little confused about that because it was that, well, yeah, like people understand it. It costs different to be there. And if this is a location specific job, you're going to pay differently, right? Like, but I don't know what your experiences have been.
I think it's interesting too, because I'm sure you all have dealt with the situation of, especially as a consultant, being asked the question of, if the employee is mandatory, supposed to be in that location versus an employee that moves to a location by choice. Yeah. And so the nice part about hybrid jobs or working from home is you do sometimes have the ability to move to different locations, based on your company's, as they allow. And so the question is, okay, do we increase salaries for employees that are moving to these high labor markets? Or if we don't, then you're at risk of losing those employees to the people that are paying that. And so I've seen companies do it both ways. I've seen companies say, no, if you move to high cost of labor, then where you're at currently, that we're not going to increase pay. I've also seen them say, okay, well, maybe they have a certain time frame. So within a year during your next evaluation, are they going to put them on the higher pay scale? So I think that's also an interesting topic too that a lot of companies are dealing with since having work from home policies. So just interested if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
That's definitely something I've heard. Again, do we differentiate based on whether or not it was a voluntary move or, involuntary? Do we differentiate based, on, for instance, I mean, I would get I actually got that question a lot past few years doing pay transparency talks. And that was often an issue around, do you agree? Should we be increasing people or not? Or do we take away, do we decrease pay because they move to a lower economic area? And do you maintain? And again, that's where I get back to, okay, first assess what you have, how prevalent is this issue for you? And then the second piece is, just going to say it out loud. It's nobody ever feels good about getting a decrease. So I understand, on paper, it makes sense, but it's like, hey, Nancy, you're doing a great job, but you moved. So we're going to decrease your pay by 10%. Awesome. So that's something that, again, I really question from an employee experience point of view. Now with pay equity, that also becomes an issue because now I have somebody who's come from a high cost area, living in a lower cost area. And when we do the evaluation, they're going to pop out. Yeah. So then how do we deal with that? So I don't think it's not an easy question. I don't think it's something that you can cover just in sort of a blanket policy. It has to be sort of a case by case basis. And then it's got to be something that you have to decide as an employer, like what is going to be our stance, what's our position. And I think Catherine, you said it too, is basically our rewards helping retain our employees? Right? Is it meeting that objective? What is that employee experience depending on the moves that we make?
Yeah. And one of the things that, I think is be really helpful if we have a little bit of conversation around too, is how do we communicate that? Because I do think that people are very familiar and comfortable with the idea that it is more expensive to live in New York than it is in Kansas. It is more expensive to live in Honolulu than Oklahoma, but it's not a one-to-one change. So there's a study that Kroner surveys had put out, and they had referenced a few locations, whereas Palo Alto has a 155% cost of living increase, but only a 33% cost of labor increase. New York, 147% versus 127% cost of labor. Honolulu, 146% versus 102% cost of labor. So they're paying the national average, but it's 50% more expensive to live there. One of the things that I have heard in the past that helped me understand it a little bit better, but I don't know that I would totally accept it, was you get what you pay for. So if you think about these places you live, Honolulu is a great example. I have not been, but I've seen pictures, and I know that you are paying a premium to live in a very nice location that in many times can be a paradise. New York, you have the convenience of living in a major city with all the culture, those things, everything's walkable or taxiable or what have you. But I think that, from the employee's perspective, it's like, well, if it costs that much more, I should be earning that much more. And I wonder if anyone else has run across or had an opportunity to have a conversation with employees where they saw the light bulb go off, or any strategies that we can share with other folks that are having these conversations. There's been a lot of comments that said, this is a very frequent conversation we have, and I would love to see if we can impart some wisdom and some tips on how to communicate that to employees. We can come back to it.
That's like the $1 million question.
Yeah.
I think it's consistent. I think part of the key is being consistent. I don't think there's any magic sort of words. Yes. But I think bringing it back to making it, having a conversation with the employee and coming up with a rationale that makes sense for your organization. And then being as transparent as possible and as consistent. And that takes consistency, making sure that people aren't having different sort of ideas that, oh, Nancy's a pretty good negotiator, so she negotiated herself a nice little package for where she's living. But Catherine was, nicer about it and just assumed that they were going to pay her, the same, and they didn't. So like that kind of a thing too, I think is really important. But I don't know that there's a magic bullet, except that it should be something that you can speak to that foots with everything else you're talking about as a company, and coming right back to how you describe how you reward, what your philosophy is, and then what your philosophy is around what employees can expect working at your company. And that may include trade-offs. I haven't seen a company come out with a comp philosophy that says we are the top payer. We want to lead the market in every market we're in. So, usually it's competitively and fairly, like those are the words that they're using. And it's usually has to do with, and for the type of work that we're doing here, and this is what competitive means, and kind of explaining that. And there's a little more nuance to it than that. And I think it's a similar type of conversation. But I'd love to hear what other folks have experienced.
I mean, I think you're right. There's no magic words, no silver bullet for this one. But a light bulb moment that I experienced was with a good friend of mine who was a senior director, worked in the tech space, lived in San Fran, and then during COVID, her work became remote, and she moved back home, rural Virginia. And then she took another job after a few years at a San Fran tech company, but it was remote, and they told to her, there's a cost of labor difference, and therefore you're not being offered the San Fran rates. And she thought it was garbage. She was, called me, said, how do I negotiate this? And I said, there is a cost of labor difference. And we talked through it. And what she ended up coming to was, oh yeah, my networking events aren't around a whole lot of other tech people because I'm in rural Virginia. My opportunity for increasing education and knowledge is, so she sort of came to, okay, there is an economy around talent, skill, knowledge share that I think it's harder for remote folks to understand, but my outcomes are the same if I work at this desk or if I work at that desk. It doesn't matter what, city and state I'm in. But that was one of her, like, she kind of came to that aha moment through the conversation. I thought that was pretty interesting. And I think the cost of labor thing is a little bit easier to talk about when it's location-based because you have to go into a facility. I think it becomes more difficult in a remote setting.
Yeah, that actually brings me, that's been my thought around remote work. Like when you're fully remote, I do question the use of any sort of geographic differential. Because in that sense, I do think you make the argument, just like you said, Catherine, the outcomes are the same. So shouldn't we be paying the same? And that doesn't mean you pay national. You could pay, obviously, like you can have a national, say, philosophy. You're paying, what you're really paying is maybe above national, as we kind of understand it. But I do think there's something to the outcomes are the same. I did hear about one company, and I come back to it again and again, this idea of what if we paid everybody, just what we paid them, and they could be anywhere in the world. And again, administratively, lots of issues with that, but I just thought that was a really cool way to think about it. I heard about them. They were a small company, they were somehow able to do it. But they literally had people who had like starkly different living experiences because they just had sort of one salary for a job, and it didn't matter where in the world you were. And that was just sort of fascinating to me.
Yeah. There was someone shared a story with me where they took that philosophy and were looking for local talent using U.S. value cost of labor, looking for local talent in markets where it was, the local cost was significantly lower. And they thought, we're just going to pay them, make them feel like kings and queens. And in 5 years, they could all retire. And they did. So I was like, was that the right business strategy?
Okay. Well, that was a really good cautionary tale. What are the risks? Well, you make people really wealthy and they don't work for you anymore. Okay.
Right.
I like that. That's good. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Well, one of the other things that I have seen, one of the things that I think is really interesting too is, who does cost of living apply to? Is it truly kind of folks that are below that threshold, or should it impact everybody? And I know that we have talked around geographic differentials. And I know in many of the things that we have all done, we know that geographic differentials vary based on the level of the role and the pay of the role. The executive level, you are looking at a national labor pool, versus if you are looking at manufacturing and warehousing, you are looking at that local labor pool. And there are big differences. The minimum wage in Texas is $7.25. In Seattle, it's $16, $17 an hour. It's a 200% geographic differential. But again, we go back to the cost of living being very different. And so one of the things that, as we're talking through, there should be a living wage, we should take it into consideration. I think it's a really interesting problem to solve as well. How do we take that into consideration? There is not a cost of living by job like there is for the cost of labor. And so one of the questions that I would pose is there a minimum that we would look at, adjusting pay to? I know Gravity Payments in Seattle, several years ago, they raised the floor where nobody made less than $70,000 a year. It was not aligned to market by any stretch at that time, and it created lots of compression issues. But financially, they did very well, and it was a very strong signal to, we are interested in our employees' well-being. They had lower retention rates. They were financially doing well. And I'm curious, just on the opinions of the group, is there a direct, or do we need to just look at the lower income folks, or is it going up to all the way through? Is there a geographic differential approach that we would typically see? And let's let Nancy back in.
Everybody's jumping on.
That's bad, apparently. I don't know.
I mean, the one thing about comp is, I feel, any argument I can go either way on. So if I have one big argument, I can literally argue myself out of that one too. So I think, Justin, it really is what works for your company. And sometimes it's unfortunately trial and error. And just looking at, I think as, we monitor hot jobs, like let's say an Apple is having a hard time finding their hardware engineers, and they're having to put all of that function or maybe all their engineers into their higher tier salary structures. Things like that, that's just going to end up working for your company to make your company goals. I think I personally wouldn't go by different income levels as far as besides like excluding executives out of that, but I would try to make it as consistent across all levels as possible. And also, the good enough cost of living model, where you just have maybe 1 to 3 tiers of different markets, where you have, your baseline, your medium, your high markets, and just kind of managing those groups, I think would be administratively a little bit more easier to explain and to manage. And then as you're monitoring, like I said, those hot jobs, what makes sense and what market do you want to put them in or pay at?
Right. Since we're bringing out our dogs.
That's awesome.
My goodness. We have additions to the paper. Puppy practitioners. I don't know. Puppy panel. What do you have to say, little dog? Oh, now we need to know their names.
Yeah.
This is Taco.
Hey, Taco.
I love it.
Homer.
Homer. Oh, I'm very jealous.
Those are like behaved dogs. They need to teach my dogs a few things. They'd be like biting my ankles right now.
It's funny. It's funny, Ashley, yeah, what you're saying makes total sense. But then I'm also recalling an executive who would not have been part of the group that you would have worried about with cost of living. But that executive is quite sensitive to the fact that he had moved from North Carolina to the Metro New York area. And he was just the housing, there is I guess the part of it too is just making sure. I think, Catherine, it's similar to the conversation you were having with your friend. Let's just have a minute to sort of level set your expectations of life, based on this change. So he was at the mind, this is years ago, but like he was of the mind that, well, like the life I had there, I'm just transporting it here. And it's like, well, are you? I mean, okay. Like
Right.
it wasn't up to me, thankfully. So, but it was just an interesting conversation he and I were having about total rewards and what his expectation was. Like my house should be as big. And so you need to compensate me so I can have as big a house. And I'm like, boy, you don't know a lot about this area, do you?
Right.
Welcome to Metro New York.
Well, I think it's interesting too when you look at the geographic differential data by salary, right? The lower the salary, the bigger the geographic differential that you see, the higher. And it reminds me of a conversation. I wonder if it was with you, Jason, around sort of Denny's and looking at like the bus stop and the zip code almost mattered how many, dollars per hour you were paying because of the commute to all that. And I wonder if that was with you, if you have thoughts that can help me.
Well, the thing with Denny's is they're heavily concentrated in Southern California, right? So there's like a Denny's on every block. They're like Starbucks down there. But yeah, it was a challenge because there would be literally in LA County, there were two Denny's that were almost literally across the street from each other, but they were in different minimum wage areas. Like there were two different minimum wages for them. It was crazy. But yeah, and in those cases, we did have to get down to like all of that. But like normally, those are restaurant workers, right? And so the bus stop thing, I don't think I ever mentioned that. But yeah, I mean, that would be something like a stipend or of sorts or whatever if you had to accommodate for that. And speaking of that, I had a client in New York City who had a person in a multiple incumbent role. So it was EVP of whatever, but there were like 5 or 6 of them across the organization. They're really individual contributors, but this person moved from New York City where there's city taxes and state taxes and it's expensive, and they got a parking stipend. They got, and they were remote in New York City as well, but the headquarters are in New York City. So they were paid like they lived in New York City because they did. But then they decided they wanted to move to Florida, to rural Florida, where there's no state income tax, no parking issues at all, but there wasn't an office down there either. So he called me trying to figure out, does he need to take their pay down? Because that's a significant, that their purchasing power, currently they make about the same as the other 5 people in that role. But like, yeah, that person's purchasing power is going to increase drastically. $200,000 in Florida is a lot of money, right? Compared to $200,000 in New York City. I told him, I didn't tell him one way or the other. I said it was your call, but like, I would kind of maybe create a zoned pay structure at that point, because that's a pretty egregious example of somebody moving from one cost area to another really low cost area. So, but yeah, I mean, again, it's one-off situations. It's hard to plan for that as an entire company, to say that this is how we're going to do it every time this happens. So I hope that makes sense. But yeah,
Yeah, especially in markets that are more volatile. I'm in the energy industry, so we see a lot of swings in the market. And so, 1 year you might want to do, maybe not 1 year, but if you're advising clients who are looking at salary structures or creating them and they are in a cost conscious environment, you might recommend a discount structure where a different company you might not. And so I think it's also depending on where a company is actually at, and their challenges as well of how you kind of navigate through those.
Well, I have always advised away from discount structures. I think discount structures are garbage, and that it penalizes people for growing up and living in the place that they live. When it's really like a 10%, at most 10% probably off of the national average difference. Everywhere I've worked, like one place I worked, 2 places I worked, had a discount zone, and I managed to get that out of there because it's not a good look. Why not just have your base zone be your base zone and then everything on top of that? So yeah.
Interesting choice of words, because that discount market could be your base. national
Well, it could be. No, it could be. I mean, that's okay though. Like
Yeah.
that could be your base. If your headquarters are in Columbia, South Carolina, then you're going to have a really, cheap pay structure for that zone. But if you've got offices in San Francisco, of course, you're going to have a different pay structure for them. But yeah, you're right. I mean, but having a national average pay structure, right, or a zone, and then one lower than that, I don't know. It felt chintzy to me. It didn't feel good,
I hear you.
especially since I'm in that discount zone. So yeah.
Yeah, let's say for the employees that are
It's
living
differently than.
yeah, they don't want to hear that.
Right.
Right.
No, it's been really interesting too. And I think one of the things I like everything ties back to just a hand.
Good to hear from you, Justin. All right.
Hello. You're back.
What I was trying to say was that I do think it's interesting. Everything more or less ties back to a handful of bullet points that I think we can kind of sum up compensation with. And one of the ones that I think Victoria mentioned here, that I really like this, is it all comes back to, do employees feel aligned with the mission and the vision of the org? Because at the end of the day, we can approach this with a higher market percentile. We can approach it with stipends. We can approach it with additional benefits that may be outside of typical pay. But a lot of it is really just making sure that employees feel valued, and it's a retention tool. So I really love how we kind of keep seeing that come back and back, because there are a handful of North Stars that I think that we as comp teams have that we can really look towards whenever we are trying to navigate a fairly difficult conversation or a fairly difficult and subjective challenge that we may have, this being one of them, to really figure out what's the right approach for us and how do we want to make these changes in the business. And it's been really, really, I think, truly interesting to see how everyone has taken this a little bit differently, but also fundamentally in a very similar approach.
Yeah.
That was almost a wrap up, but I didn't mean for it to actually end things. So
I was going to mention something else too.
Yeah, please do.
It's directly related to what all of us do every day. Even though I'm hoping to get to the point where I don't do this anymore, is benchmarking jobs and trying to figure out, like if you're going to price nationally and then apply a geographic differential to something, like I had that same client in New York City, like, when you're using national data, it already includes New York City incumbents, right? So am I doing the right thing by applying 126% cost of labor geographic differential to their stuff? I don't know. I don't think it's that clean, because that is a practice in consulting where you price nationally and apply the geographic differential, right? And I guess a lot of companies do that for jobs that they don't have a lot of data for. And this could be a whole other panel for sure. But, it's just still kind of been a question in my head for the last 20 years. Is that the right approach when you're trying to use those geographic differentials in your pricing? Are you overdoing it by just doing the full in San Francisco cost of labor compared to the national average on top of the national data? I don't know, but especially in an industry that might be focused in San Francisco, and that's the national data is San Francisco. So either way, just wanted to throw that nugget out there for anybody who might be struggling with it. I don't have an answer. I just wanted to say it. So
I think my advice on that would be try to apples to apples on surveys. So if you're pulling like a Radford, pricing jobs through Radford, that's going to be heavily influenced by the Bay Area salaries and also tech. And so if you're using a geo differential that you pull from ERI, that's going to look for San Francisco to be, let's just say 25 to 30%. When in reality, the actual geo differential, because of the influence already, it's going to only be like, let's say 15%.
Right.
So I would highly encourage you to, I know a lot of surveys don't just offer that location analysis, but you can even do it yourself through the surveys that you use and apply those type of geo differentials to your actual data as well.
right.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Understanding sort of the participants and the makeup of the data that you're using before you start manipulating it with premiums and discounts and how you weight them.
It's been interesting. We are actually working on a project like this with the squirrel data In Squirrel Data, we've got like 50 plus million data points, and we can identify and have grouped like a number of jobs that are very similar across, all the different locations based on their titles. And you're right. Like the geographic differentials are, when we looked at it at first, we're like, well, that doesn't look quite right because it doesn't always align to kind of what you would expect in one location versus another. So when we start to really drill into it, I think it will be really interesting to consider. But I mean, at the same time, too, it's when you look at one survey, a lot of that's already baked in. One of the ones I thought was really interesting, just to throw this out there, is just something to think about, too. Think about international surveys. A lot of the companies that participate in international surveys are U.S. based. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the international data you're getting is still from U.S. companies referring to the employees they have hired overseas that are still, in many cases, they are applying U.S. Compensation practices over to a certain extent. They're at least, there is some of that in the decisions and how those are made. So when you think about that, it's always important to look at the participants and the industries in those surveys, because it may, I don't want to say poison the well, but there may be some influence that may not be expected from other, based on the participants.
Yeah, I think you all make really great points, because what you described, Jason, is what I did for years, in consulting. But we have so much more rich data now at our fingertips. So I love, Justin, how you're talking about, again, what other data points can you use, to as your reference points, or like Catherine and Ashley talking about looking at those participants, maybe running your own analyses side by side and really gut checking some of the things that you would normally rely on, and then coming up with what's the delta, right? How different is it? Where might we adjust? Because there's just so much more data that we can use now to make those types of decisions.
Yeah. Well, this has been great. And I really appreciate the spicy takes. It's a fun conversation. It's one that comes up quite a bit. So it has been a great Pay Practitioners Panel Friday, Friday the 13th. We will be back in 2 weeks, February 27th. I think we'll be joined by our full practitioners panel.
I won't be here.
Okay, almost the full panel. But no, we look forward to seeing everybody except for Jason. We're sad about missing you in 2 weeks, but we look forward to seeing everybody else in 2 weeks. And thanks all for the time. We'll look forward to seeing you guys then. Thanks, everybody.
Thank y'all.